Watergate, in retrospect, is one of the biggest turning points in American politics that we've ever experienced. It is the beginning of the collapse in Americans' faith and trust in institutions. Watergate, I think, is best understood not as an event, but as a mindset, this paranoid, conspiratorial style of politics that Richard Nixon brought to the presidency leading up to his resignation in August 1974. Where we now understand Watergate begins is not in 1972 with the burglary at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, but actually the fall of 1968, when Richard Nixon is running for president against the sitting Vice President Hubert Humphrey.
Tonight, I again proudly accept that nomination for President of the United States.
In the fall of 1968, of course, the Vietnam War is going strong. And as Lyndon Johnson is thinking about the end of his presidency, he wants to push the Vietnam War to a conclusion and convenes what we now call the Paris peace talks.
There were reports earlier from Paris that the U.S. and North Vietnam were on the verge of a breakthrough, that the president could now order an end of all air attacks.
When Nixon hears this, he's convinced that he's going to spring it on Nixon in the last weeks of the campaign and let Humphrey sort of soar to victory on a feeling that peace is at hand.
Richard Nixon realizes that the end of the Vietnam War is going to be bad for him politically. So he engages in some remarkable duplicity. He works with a Washington socialite named Anna Chennault to send a message to the South Vietnamese government that says he will make a better deal for the South Vietnamese than they will get with Lyndon Johnson. To put a very fine point on this, Richard Nixon tries to keep the Vietnam War going in the fall of '68 for his own personal political benefit as a presidential candidate.
Nixon's the one. At almost midday Eastern Time, NBC News projected Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, when it became evident he had carried Illinois.
So this Chennault affair becomes the scandal that he must keep buried no matter what.
Exchanges between the President of the United States.
In 1971, the Pentagon Papers come out.
Good evening. Another installment today from a secret Pentagon report. It says that while Lyndon Johnson was running for president in 1964, while the Democrats were depicting Senator Goldwater as trigger-happy, bomb-happy, and a warmonger, Johnson already had a secret plan to expand the war after the election.
The Pentagon Papers should be one of the great political triumphs of Richard Nixon's career. There are 2 million words in the Pentagon Papers, and not a single one of them is Richard Nixon. Nixon is afraid, as the Pentagon Papers are leaked in the spring of 1971, that the Chennault affair will come out as part of these leaks.
One after another, he sends the Justice Department into court, and they stop the New York Times from publishing, and then the Washington Post, and then the Boston Globe.
A federal judge today ordered the New York Times to suspend temporarily publication of a series of reports based on a secret Pentagon study of how the United States became involved in the Vietnamese War.
And so you had this chain reaction of all America's editors getting together and saying, we'll all go to jail together, but we're going to show that the truth gets out.
When these documents leaked, it emboldened the press. The New York Times' decision to publish these classified documents, despite threats from the Nixon administration, was a bold assertion of the media's role in informing the public, even when it meant challenging the government.
Finally, it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, no, people have a right to see this if it's properly screened of the classified material. And Nixon has now suffered a huge public humiliation in a fight that he didn't really even have to get into.
The challenge of Richard Nixon is Nixon was never really able to get out of his own way. He was paranoid, he was conspiratorial, he thought everyone was always out to get him.
And there's this feeling that, this is going to happen again and again and again. They're going to keep leaking this stuff, so we're going to put together a team to stop leaks. And that team, of course, is called the Plumbers.
And the Plumbers are the men behind that burglary at the Watergate complex and the Democratic National Committee offices in June of 1972.
A controversial day in politics. A man arrested trying to bug the offices of the Democratic National Committee in Washington turns out to be an employee of President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign committee.
On the night of June 17, 1972, G. Gordon Liddy, E. Howard Hunt, James McCord, and 5 Cuban burglars breaks into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C. And over the course of the next couple of days, FBI investigators, D.C. police investigators, and journalists, including the Washington Post's Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, begin to unravel that the burglars here have ties to the Nixon White House.
McCord and his accomplices, meanwhile, have been charged with second-degree burglary and released on bail. But I don't think that's the last we're going to hear of this story.
The Watergate story was kept alive in the fall of 1972, to a great extent by the Washington Post. That was their heroic moment. They kept publishing stories when everybody else, many others in the press corps, were saying, oh, he's going to win in a landslide. What use is this?
Watergate was a seismic shift in American journalism. Now, before that, there was often an unquestioning reverence for the presidency. At that time, there were more cozy relationships in Washington. The press tried to have access, right? Watergate transformed journalism from being somewhat deferential to those in power to actively holding them accountable.
The irony is that Watergate effectively does not end up influencing the fall 1972 election at all.
We are not sure that President Nixon's victory in the election is the biggest landslide on record, but it surely was one of the biggest ever. This adds up to a record-breaking 521 electoral votes for President Nixon, who won 49 states.
It's really James McCord's letter to the court in March of 73 that blows the Watergate story wide open.
There was a sensational development in the Watergate trial today. One of the key defendants says there was political pressure and perjury involved in the trial.
James McCord tells the federal judge that he's been pressured to lie and that he's got all sorts of things he can tell the judge about what was going on, and that this was being run from the top, from the White House, from the Attorney General, and that skyrockets all over the country.
McCord's accusations about the Watergate trial have increased the tempo of the Senate investigation of the case. The Select Senate Watergate Committee met today in closed session.
You see in the weeks that follow the appointment of a special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, who begins to dig into the Watergate cover-up. And you see the convening in the Senate of a special committee headed by Sam Ervin, who begin to hold, what we now call the Watergate hearings.
Here in Washington today, the Select Senate Committee to investigate the Nixon re-election scandals began its work in the Senate caucus room.
The televised Watergate hearings were a game changer. They brought this very complex political scandal into America's living rooms. They were watching the key figures testifying. It was the visual element that made this abstract concept of government corruption very tangible and personal for millions of Americans.
The Watergate hearings bring in all of the biggest names in this scandal for blockbuster, explosive testimony. None that is more explosive than the revelation by Alexander Butterfield in the summer of 1973 that there is a secret recording system in the Oval Office.
At those hearings, he testified that the system was checked often and worked properly.
In the wake of Alex Butterfield's revelations about the White House taping system at the Watergate hearings, Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox begins to zero in on getting some of those tapes.
And from that point on, Nixon's presidency is a battle over control of those tapes, because once they get out, he's doomed.
This issue comes to a head in October 73. Richard Nixon, in the end, orders the firing of the special prosecutor. a night that becomes known as the Saturday Night Massacre.
Good evening. The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history.
When Nixon fires the special prosecutor, you have this idea that Attorney General Richardson had to fire the prosecutor, Archibald Cox, and Richardson refuses, and he resigns. So does his Deputy Attorney General, William Rockhouse.
It's really this moment, the Saturday Night Massacre, that you see Nixon's presidency begin to unravel, because the public, the press, Congress becomes convinced there must be something on the tapes worth covering up. It's really only in hindsight that you see this fissure in American society at that moment, where the combination of Vietnam, the Pentagon Papers, and Watergate really begin to drive the collapse of Americans' faith and trust in institutions and in the presidency, and begin to lead the media to question authority and question power in Washington in a way that it had never done before.
There's a natural tension between the media and the office of the presidency, because the role of the media is really to hold powerful people accountable, and the President of the United States is arguably the most powerful person in the country, if not the world.
This Saturday Night Massacre, I think it's almost a slap in the face to the public. The public was just awestruck. They were dumbfounded that this had happened. I don't think that Nixon unravels the way he did after what happened there in October of 1973.
Of course, the Saturday Night Massacre does not in any way, in the way that Nixon had hoped, solve and put to rest the question of the White House tapes. Congress continues to pursue the tapes, and this becomes the center of the battle for the last months of the Nixon presidency.
The new special Watergate prosecutor arrived in Washington today to be sworn in and take up the investigation started by Archibald Cox.
The reality in this country is now that the special prosecutor will certainly not be hindered in carrying out his duties.
Nixon tries everything in the spring to get away from it. He releases edited transcripts of the tapes. The House Judiciary Committee then proceeds in impeachment proceedings, and the Supreme Court finally rules that the special prosecutor has a right to access to the tapes.
It is a unanimous decision, Doug, 8-0. Justice Rehnquist took no part in the decision ordering the President of the United States to turn over the tapes.
From that point on, Nixon knows it's just a matter of time, and he's got to figure out a way to leave office one way or the other.
In the end, there's one specific tape. Nixon is caught trying to use the power of the presidency to order the FBI to drop its investigation into the Watergate burglary.
President Nixon stunned the country today by admitting that he held back evidence from the House Judiciary Committee. The news has caused a storm in Washington, and some of Mr. Nixon's most loyal supporters are calling for his resignation.
As this tape is released in the summer of '74, this really spells the end of Richard Nixon's presidency.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president.
What's left unclear when Richard Nixon resigns and leaves office is whether he will still be prosecuted. And Gerald Ford ends up making the decision that he needs to pardon Richard Nixon in order to move Ford's own presidency forward.
It could go on and on and on, or someone must write the end to it. I have concluded that only I can do that.
It is enormously controversial. He knows that it will be enormously controversial, and ultimately it costs him his own election in 1976.
Post-Watergate, we see newsrooms that become more skeptical of the official narratives, and then individuals, citizens, the society, the viewers, the readers, they also become skeptical, but not just of government, but also of news as well.
We're living in this era where it can be really, really tough to report and to help people understand that there are still facts, that there is still truth, even if some of the people that are taking in our reporting, they want to go out and sort of find facts that fit their worldview.
That erosion of trust is the huge legacy of Watergate. Whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing, it certainly has made us more wary. Whether that wariness goes too far and has become destructive, I think is something we need to think about.
A lot of people look at Watergate as a story of how a system was broken. But to me, Watergate actually represents this incredible, hopeful story of how the system works. There's a role for the FBI, the Justice Department, the House, the Senate, the media, the District Court, the Appeals Court, the Supreme Court, and every one of them has a part to play and must play that part in order to bring Richard Nixon to justice.
The role of the media is still the role that was outlined in the U.S. Constitution. It is still a role where reporters are trying to hold the most powerful people accountable, where reporters are asking tough questions, where reporters are seeking truth and are trying to really make sure that they get the American public answers to pressing questions that impact their daily lives.
We also see that America woke up and realized that the American public has to be more determined to hold those in power accountable.
Watergate, as we now understand, of course, is intimately related and linked to the Pentagon Papers and to Vietnam. And it forever changes the way that America looks at its government, looks at the presidency. It is, in many ways, I think, the turning point on which the entire second half of the 20th century in American politics turns.
Nightly Films is sponsored by Pfizer.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.